Okay, so my name is Geraint Evans.
I'm Rosalind Davis, and we're in conversation today with Sasha, who you taught and I've worked with for many years now. Part of how was we had a group show here 2 years ago, Shapeshifters. That was as well the kind of beginning of the introduction about this having a solo show in this space.
There were 5 of us in the show, and we had like a mini residency within this space. And while we were here for the week, I just fell in love with the whole space, and I thought, I want to do something. And I wanted to use the space, the fact that it's a Georgian house, that it's domestic, and then also kind of play with that and think about how we display work and how you display work differently in different areas. And so for this show, I've broken it up into, at the minute, we're in a kind of stately home or grand house, which is made up of a photo montage of many stately homes and grand houses. And this is kind of the bridging room, which is why we started in here. And then we've got the museum space over there, and then we've got the living room. And it's a bridging space because this is where stately homes and grand houses, where kind of museums and collections started. We went off on the grand tour and brought things back, started to display them, and that was the beginning of the museum idea.
So this this was something that you'd used this kind of backdrop in the Nottingham Castle show as well, a kind of response to a collection.
Yeah, absolutely.
There.
Yeah, so that was a very specific backdrop that was a photo montage of one of their spaces, taking pictures from the past and from the, and the present and making it into one thing, whereas this is from many places. And actually quite a lot of places where I've worked, because I work in stately homes.
Okay. This idea of montage and of these kinds of almost these, for me, these are signifiers of kind of power and kind of wealth and kind of, you know, the idea of the collection that comes out of that idea of the powerful, and these images which have again similar kinds of signifiers. The fact that these would have been portraits commissioned at all, the paintings themselves kind of signify that idea. So obviously it's something that you're surrounded by in your other life, but you know, is there something of that? I mean, why did you start to respond or want to work with these kinds of
with the pictures or with the space?
Well, to me, I think there's almost something related between this idea of these grand chandeliers and these huge spaces and these kinds of references to kind of classical kind of architecture, and then these kinds of portraits of, you know, in here, these kind of male figures in these grand sort of clothes, you know, perhaps doing worthy things, like at a writing desk or something like that.
Well, they'd like to think that they're doing worthy things.
Of course.
I mean, they're like a traditional formal photograph. Obviously, those days you can have your photograph, but they're obviously in their best finery and they're doing something, yes, very important. There's some kind of scholarly thing going on there, and, you know, ridiculous clothing and all of that. And although they're portraits, and there's something about portraits that's to do with vanity. To, you know, to sit for your portrait, you've got to have some kind of ego. And I don't think that the artists were necessarily very interested in the actual sitter that it would have been commissioned to do. And I've always been more interested, when I look at them, at the skill of those old masters in how they paint, at the particularly cloth and the hair and all the extremities, and all those things are signifiers of identity. And although I've called this show Hairy Interventions, it's not about hair. There is a lot of hair in it, but it's about identity, and I'm using hair as a way of talking about identity. Because, well, how you look and your hair, you choose whether you shave it off, whether you leave it long, and it's a way you describe people. It's also got your DNA in it, so it is you. So there's like multiple layers to hair, which we'll talk about more in the different spaces.
And just to give a bit of context, these are paintings that Sasha has made on top of book plates or sometimes postcards. So this is a kind of a collaboration with an old master, and part of the kind of trickery and the metamorphosis is that there is a very it's very difficult to see where you've intervened, because you've done it so well, but we know that you've done it because, of course, they're changed. They're changelings.
Yeah.
And so you're always blocking out anything that's about a feature. You know, the face and the hands and the human parts are very much taken away, so you can never find any.
Or covered up.
Covered up, yeah.
Yeah.
Rather covered up,
Yeah.
or disguised, or camouflaged, or, you know.
And part of that is to make you look closely at them, and not necessarily to look at what I've done, but also to look at what the original artist's done. And obviously, because they're pages from books that I've taken out, so they're no longer paintings. And so they've got no paint, the scale's wrong, the colour's wrong, and all of that. And so I paint with oil paint to make them back into paintings. And it's a way of me studying those artists, and also as a homage, although quite a kind of cheeky, mischievous homage to them. Yeah, and if they were alive, maybe they wouldn't like it.
And there's something about the hair or the wig, you know, as a kind of, you know, maybe a 18th century sort of idea again of sort of vanity and sort of again of display and power and
well, especially as most of them would have been bald underneath due to syphilis.
Okay.
So not so attractive.
So glad you
underneath.
brought that up.
But it's all the fault of Louis XIV, isn't it? When he really went into the big wigs, when he lost his hair, because he was known for his big hair, and then he gets syphilis and he loses it, and then he does all the big wig thing.
Yeah.
It's also quite nice having everybody in the space, because it used to be that all the stately homes were open all the time. You could just pop round. Did people know that when they were first built? Have you read Pride and Prejudice? There's a scene in that when they go to Darcy's house, and that was quite normal. You could go to anybody's house.
Wow.
Probably not us, because we're not very important people, but that was a part of the thing that you showed off your collection, and they didn't have to be in, and you would just go, and sometimes you had to wait. People complained because there was another tour ahead of them.
Can I ask, when you knew you were going to have this show, were you envisaging this as the outcome, or does this progress? I mean,
it progressed, but
it was going to be another thing, wasn't it?
Well, it was going to be more just about display. There were going to be there was always going to be separate areas, and it was going to be more just about how we displayed things. So it was going to be almost the same object displayed differently within different environments. But I kind of have done that in a way, but that it was all before the hairy thing happened, and that just came from playing. And then it seemed like a really good conduit to join everything together.
I mean, the one thing, of course, that happens with these things is there's something humor. You know, there's a degree of humor, but they're also kind of grotesque and kind of absurd. And I guess, as you say, they must have come out of play. But there's a sense, if you look at the way that, you know, the videos and the various objects, a kind of hint of a sort of either absurd or a surreal kind of quality, perhaps. You know,
there's definitely a surreal quality and a playful kind of childhood quality where the world is kind of surreal because everything's new, and it's also it's a kind of poking fun at pomposity, I guess, of not taking everything completely seriously. Although obviously I'm using skill, and there's a kind of it's quite a nice thing of using oil paint and a brush with two hairs to do something that's kind of a bit silly.
I think it's also something about, you know, these returning these. I mean, these things are found maybe in I was going to say thrift stores, but we're not in America. What would we say? In junk shops. And just thinking of Jim Shaw's. And this idea of giving them value through your intervention, so they've suddenly acquired this other sort of value which they didn't have. So there's this kind of shifting into the reproduction, into the discarded, into the reclaimed, and then into something that is given this sort of other value. And through that is given through this, bound up in this sense of craft and skill and kind of, you know, those things that the painter or the artist gives to things. And I think there's something about, I keep coming to this thing of value, you know, that, you know, is sort of in and out of the show to some degree. And when we look at some of these, whether they're specimens or artifacts or the objects in the vitrines, to me that is an object which is given this other kind of, you know, it's a signifier of a kind of certain value of something, and that comes through again these almost the language of the museum and through display and those things, you know.
Shall we walk through?
I think that's probably a good idea. So we're talking briefly about I started talking about these objects, which you know they seem to have many interpretations or characters to them. But placing them within the vitrine, using display in that way, is ascribing some kind of value. It's calling our attention, isn't it? And it's kind of about how things have to be preserved, because there's a certain significance or cultural value perhaps to them. You mentioned earlier, I'm not sure what I call them. I call them either specimens or artifacts, and I think you used another one.
I used relic.
Relic, yeah. And of course, they have this thing about them where they are, obviously, you get this sense of their handmaidens, or them being
Squeezed,
yeah, and all of that, the haptic quality. But there's also these things where they look almost like creatures or bones. There's buttocks and holes, orifices of various kinds, and but then there's this kind of careful sort of threading of these sometimes braided hair. So there's a sense of something that isn't so much sprouted as perhaps it's something that's been carefully
inserted
constructed,
back in.
perhaps.
Yeah. Well, there's also a thing about how people view the body with hair, and that most people are very happy with hair on the head, but we're less happy with it sprouting in different areas.
Oh, hang on, this is getting too big.
There is a big thing of pubic hair. I personally have a problem with people feeling that they should remove anything because it is unclean or unsightly or anything like that. So these only have hair coming out of holes. So I'm kind of doing the opposite thing.
Yes.
But I should also mention that the shapes that are they're actually taken from some, well, not necessarily some of the things in the room, but they're kind of, that's a bit of a fleshy there. I've taken it from old master paintings or prints and stuff, combined with my bone collection.
Your bone collection?
Yeah, I'm not really sure I should tell people I have a
We're
bone
hearing
collection.
lots of things about Sasha. Tonight, we never knew. And yeah, some of these really have a kind of creature-like quality. I'm kind of intrigued by this thing of relic, and I guess that idea of how you've been collected. Some of this hair is real. Some of this hair is from.
It's artificial.
It's artificial,
yeah.
I guess. But collecting hair, and you've talked in the past about this, our relationship with hair in relation to the body. It's part of us, and yet it's sort of. It's sort of other. There's parts of it we sort of really take care of, and there's parts of it we want to remove. There's parts of it which obviously have are absolutely bound up in identity, bound up in other things. But there are times when hair can feel like it's really.
Yeah, it has a double thing of people have disgust of it. If it's away
it's
from your
repellent.
body, it's repellent.
As soon as it's detached from the body, it's something that's.
Or if because you
repulsive.
talked of a story of if your hair should touch somebody else when they don't really want it to touch them. It's like you've gone funny, yeah. But it does have all these things. It has sensuality, sexuality, but it also has repulsion, and it has a bit sort of ickiness. And it's also a liminal space, so it's the space between you and the world. It's all over you, and it's a sensor between you and the world. It's a shield and it's a sensor at the same time. And you can be, if you're intimate with somebody, you can be caressing their hair, but you're touching them, but you're not touching them at the same time. But it's still very intimate. And obviously there's the mourning jewelry. From when people died, but it was also very much as a love token that people would send, plait their hair and send it to somebody else. And we still do that very much with our children's hair. We snip a bit off, or we keep that and the little drawer forever. Might have to grow them again later or something.
That's what I was picking up on in relation to the relics, but also what you were saying about portraiture, and this discomfort we have with hair wherever it appears. That hair reveals something about us in spite of ourselves.
When there's also this element you cannot escape your hair, and it does leave a trace.
And you find it everywhere as well. In my
Which is,
country.
so when you have these works here, you think of the vanity of the sitter, and yet this stuff is just getting out there. It's almost like a correlation between to the artist's intention of trying to infer something beyond just the standard portrait. So it's, I don't know.
And they're also now covered, well, some of it is real, some of it is false, but other people's DNA, if you want to, other people's identities have now been put on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Did you, when you, I mean, made all these pieces in the museum, did you have a story going on here? Because
Between each work?
well, as a sort of, I'm kind of thinking a little bit, you know, that story about the night in the museum where everything.
Yeah.
Well, this feels like something's happened in the museum, and all of a sudden, you know, all the hairs,
Nice.
and I wondered, is there a backstory? Like the museum's kind of gone wrong, you know, it's sprouted, as it were.
No, I like that. No, they're more, I don't know, they're more playful than that. I've been thinking about the child's game that you get in a cracker, where you just get a bit of the head, and then there's a chain, and you move it around. People know what I'm talking about? And it begins to make a face. And I kind of was seeing the hair doing that within these, because they're kind of loose in that way. They each do different things, and obviously the one at the end is called Mother and Child Connected. When you have two figures, it does something different. There's already a relationship, and it brings in kind of Rapunzel, the story of Rapunzel, which is like a cutting of the umbilical cord, because she's cut away from the child is locked up, and then her hair is cut off, and so it has those kind of elements as well.
You know, to me, it goes back to this thing about the things we invest in these objects, and the fact that they have a certain resonance, and the idea that we can give this, you know, somehow give this resonance to things, even if some of these things are a stand-in, they're not the real thing, they're false hair. There's something about the power of the relic, of the you know, of the artifact or something, which I find very interesting. And you know, in a sense, all of this museological kind of display thing is helping to sort of underpin that, isn't it, in some ways, and drive that idea that there's a kind of charge within the object. And of course, this isn't, you know, this in a sense that relies on a certain history or significance or authenticity. Maybe that's not the right word. And so, in a sense, these are representations, or they're sort of
they're facsimiles of
something. But we sort of recognise that, I think. And I think that's what can make these things, you know, so powerful. It is that kind of slightly indescribable, intangible charge that objects can have. You know, particularly, I guess, within the museum or within, you know, within the church or the cathedral.
And the fact that they've been, you can't touch them, gives them another kind of weight, because they must be important, because you're not allowed to touch them. They're kind of separated from them.
The important thing is that you're using various objects of display which you've actually made yourself, including the chair and the TV.
And the walls.
And the walls. There is a kind of high quality production in which you're actually making these objects of display. And tell us a little bit about why that's so important to you. Just buy this, or is it just a kind of practicality?
Well, a lot of it's to do with practicality and wanting it to be in a particular way and having a small budget. No, I like making stuff. I've always liked making stuff, and I mean, you know, where would I go and buy a TV box?
Well, yeah.
So everything's been made specific for this. Yes, I could pay someone else to make it, I guess, but I've always liked making things, and I wanted them to be in a particular sort of way.
I think to me, you know, earlier on we were talking a little bit about the idea of the theatre and the theatre flat, in a sense.
Yeah.
And the way that you also were mentioning that almost that kind of space between perhaps the real world and a kind of fantasy or an invented world. And that's probably occurs again and again within the show. I mean,
all of it's very, very much theatrical. And before, when I knew I was going to be doing the show, I actually made a scale model of the whole place. So I've been playing for quite a long time with little things that I've been moving around, which obviously I've then been making more little things as the show's gone on. I've even made the hairy hairdryer. So each thing, and the little TV and the chair. So yeah, it's all there in miniature form. So a lot of it is to do with play and theatre and control as well. I definitely have a thing about control and hidden areas and how I want people to engage with the work. Because when you arrive at the show through the doorway, you're presented with a blank wall, which is fine. You can stay in the hallway and have a drink, or if you come in, then something will be revealed, and if you can then be bothered, there'll be more revealed around it. And I like to make a different atmosphere in different spaces. In the middle space, I know there are a lot of us in there, but it does feel quite intimate even when there's only one or two of you in there. So I'm not just making things that go on the wall or things that go in a cabinet. I actually want you to immerse yourself to a certain extent within my... So we've gone from coming to work with me in the middle, and now we're in the museum, which I visit and, I would like to perhaps one day be collected in. And then you can come around my house and watch TV, and when you're bored, you go to the cinema. So it is the whole thing. Yeah. I haven't made a garden, sorry, but that'll be next. Yes, welcome to my living room. Much more personalised than here. So they are either family friends, or I also collect anonymous photo albums. So there is a different engagement that you have with a photograph than you would have with an old portrait.
Where were they in the kind of timeline of things? Were these all going alongside each other?
No, these were late on.
Okay,
Yeah,
so what made you decide to kind of...
Well,
because you, for as long as I've known you, when you've done these interventions, have always been famous art history, painting, so...
I think when I had my model, I knew what I was doing in the ground area, and I knew what I was doing, had an idea of what I was doing in the museum area. And the living area was much more problematic, I guess, because it's a lot more personal. I don't tend to actually reveal about myself, which is probably partly to do with covering faces as well. So the film happened quite early on, and the other film in the other room. And in fact, when Geraint came to the studio to kindly write the essay, I think I showed you about 3 things. It did very well.
It obviously sets up a very different dynamic. First of all, just the technical issue of trying to integrate the kind of painted mark within the photographic mark, and that kind of different relationship, I guess. But there's this one year which, I keep coming back to, which somehow I think there's just something about the way that the photograph sort of almost bleeds and fades to nothing, that somehow that integration feels much more
a part of it.
A part of it,
yeah.
And of course, we have this. We were saying earlier, the head has become this. It's a hairy head, but it's become skull-like, or like a kind of gas mask or something. And it's a very it's quite a intriguing, but very.
Well, the hair is going back in on itself, whereas the others, the hair is covering.
But with the doll, with the child, it looks like one of those rag dolls you used to make when I was young, which was years ago. But where you just tie and it is. It's,
like wool that you tie together.
Yeah. You tie together to create something. So you've got this picture that you just turned into something playful, at the same time slightly sinister.
Well, it kind of connects more with the video as well, which is much more like puppet-like. And the figure in the video comes from the paintings. So I've kind of manifested the paintings as a three-dimensional, as an actual person. But it's also all of my childhood TV programs, all rolled into one. The puppets and the people and the surrealness and the weirdness, as well as the figures in the paintings.
So where did we've got the video in the other room. When did you decide to go, obviously you wanted to kind of represent this person, but what was the kind of shift in thinking, I'll do a video and I'll create this persona, and then you have this quite, what we were saying, almost quite fetishistic figure in the other room, but or sort of disturbed person, perhaps.
Well, that's
my
your
interpretation, yes.
The performance element comes from when I was thinking about the portraits of how there was, I think in Victorian times and earlier than that, kind of parlour game, like a sort of charades where people would dress up as the portraits in the house.
Okay.
So it seemed like a completely linear thing to do, to actually dress, try and become the portraits that I had done. And then, what would you be doing if you were a hairy person? You'd be thinking hairy things.
I think when you said earlier, I guess I hadn't really thought about it so much in relation to children's programs. And then, of course, there is something about that reoccurrence of a kind of slightly absurd and surreal sort of language, which maybe when I was younger I said earlier, it was Michael Benteen or something, so it's potty time, so that came out of that. But it came out of a, quite serious comedic sort of tradition, which was
which also came post-war as a reaction to all of that.
Which was the Goons and which was Monty Python, I guess, where there was that kind of irrational kind of thing that was going on. But there was also other things I keep thinking about. Obviously, things like the singing ring, we won't go there. But things like Ludwig, this kind of very strange cartoon. But then, I suppose there is something about, the childhood eye, which, it's unquestioned.
That's right. When the surreal is normal. Yeah, it is just normal. That's how it's shown to you, and you just go with it, completely go with it, and don't question it, whether it's a puppet, whether it's a person, it doesn't matter. And they're doing their strange thing. And it's just
and that's interesting as well, that interchangeability between the human and the puppet, between the representation and, the real, if you like. And I think that's always fascinated me in a way, the way that you develop that skill very early on to kind of be able to recognise signs, between a drawing of a thing, a cartoon of a thing, a photograph of a thing, the thing, and it's quite, within a heartbeat. You learn that absolutely early on, but it becomes something to really, think about and question when you start going to art school. And that kind of happens, through the way that we have this as a sort of representation, a photographic representation, but it's also a kind of montage, it's a cutout, and then this, which is of course a 3D thing, but it's also of course, it's really it's an image really. And then we have this.
And that's where the sound's actually coming in.
And it's sort of echoed in the kind of flats behind us,
So in contrast to the other two, because it really has a feeling of relationships inside the home, and especially with the images, people being tied together through hair, and the hair is so expressive in these ones, of the kinds of relationships. That's the way I feel about them, and I really, really like that. Was that something you were aware of when you were doing them?
Yeah, the approach to them is very different, because I'm not approaching them because they were never paintings.
No.
So I haven't got any of that weight of history or another artist or anything like that. And some of them are me and my friends and my family. And that gives a different kind of weight to what you do to them, how you're going to play with that, and what intimacies you're going to bring together, what secrets you're going to bring out, what stories you're going to tell. They're not the actual photographs. I've re-photographed them and then printed them out to the size that I wanted for this show.
There's an edge as well, whatever you might read in relation to, we were talking earlier about the relationships, that I was reading them in one way and Sasha was seeing them in others, things shifting from being kind of disturbing to tender all in sort of one conversation. But there's something about that intervention, and the intervention on the face, particularly in the photograph, which to me sort of does reference kind of early surrealist or collage, punk collage. Whatever happens, once you sort of intervene, and particularly in the face, there is a sort of maybe implied violence.
Can I ask you, Sasha, about your three-dimensional work, which is slightly, because we've just discussed a lot about pictures and the relationship with the artist, but this is much more, you've taken objects, you've deconstructed them, you've put them back together again, you've done something quite different, and in your previous work, obviously, then translated that into two-dimensional images. Whereas now you've got into three-dimensional images, and it's quite unusual, I suppose, for you in a sense, it's a different departure. So just tell us a little bit.
Tell us about that. Yeah, well, previously I've never made sculpture that was specifically made to be photographed, was not to be seen. And it just seemed more appropriate within a domestic space that you would have. I was thinking about what you'd have in your living room. And I kind of do feel like they're made in the same way as the pictures, of taking elements from the pictures and moving them around, not so much in the photographic work, but in the painting work. I'm taking elements that are already there and moving them around. So these are made up from lots of objects that I've broken up.
But much less recognisably the original object, aren't they?
How do you know? They're not an artist. Well, although they are based on some objects that I've seen in museums.
Probably it's time to sort of draw to a close. Now I'll just kind of end with just kind of quoting Graham Crowley's essay of Sasha's work. Invisibility, absence, and the act of eurasia collectively conspire to both frustrate and enhance our appreciation of her work. A single and precise reading is denied, not because the work is vague, but because it's ambiguous in some cases. Ambiguity, in all cases, ambiguity prevails. Mixed messages and coded references combine to produce an exquisite and perplexing image. The power of the imagination. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you.